Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the reforms in the United Nations Security Council as the USA exercised its veto power in the UNSC to prevent a UNSC resolution on the immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The second article is related to the fiscal health of the states as the CAG published a report on the decadal analysis of the fiscal health of the states. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the reforms needed in the United Nations Security Council, as 3 decisions were taken by the UNSC. One of them is positive from the Indian perspective, as the bid of Pakistan to get the Balochistan Liberation Army designated as a terrorist group was put on hold. A technical hold was put on it by USA, UK and France. But another decision of the UNSC is a cause of concern, as the USA vetoed a resolution for the ceasefire in Gaza, the resolution which proposed for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and for Israel to lift all restrictions upon the aid deliveries to Gaza, but it was vetoed again by USA. And in another decision, UNSC did not revoke the sanctions which were imposed upon Iran for the alleged development of the nuclear weapons going on in Iran. Therefore, we'll discuss the need for reforms in the United Nations Security Council, the question of veto power, the veto exercised by the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and why India should become a permanent member of the UNSC, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic Important International Institutions, Agencies and Fora, their structure and mandate. First, let's discuss a few facts regarding the United Nations Security Council. The UNSC is an organ of the United Nations and it was founded in 1946 as a successor to the erstwhile Council for the League of Nations, and it comprises of 5 permanent members, that is USA, Russia, China, UK and France, and additionally there are 10 non-permanent members also. Now there are 10 non-permanent members. Earlier there were 6 non-permanent members, 4 more were added after 1963. And the non-permanent members, they are elected for a term of 2 years at a time, whereas the 5 permanent members, they are the permanent members and they also have the veto power. That is, the decisions which are taken by the United Nations Security Council, they have to be taken by the consensus only. And if even one member of the permanent 5 members does not agree with that decision, then he can veto it and the decision cannot be implemented. And interestingly, it is the only organ of the United Nations whose decision must be implemented by the states. It is mandatory for the member states to implement the decisions taken by the United Nations Security Council as per the UN Charter. Now, what are the functions of the United Nations Security Council? It is for the maintenance of peace and security in the world, for the ensuring of global order. If there is a dispute between any 2 member nations, then the UNSC can recommend for the states to arrive upon the agreements. It can conduct investigations, it can mediate between the nations, it can even dispatch a mission or appoint special envoys also. And in case the dispute escalates into a conflict, then the United Nations Security Council can also give ceasefire directives. It can dispatch military observers or even send a peacekeeping force also to ensure peace in the region. Additionally, for the enforcement of the decisions taken by the United Nations Security Council, it can also impose economic sanctions, financial penalties upon the member states. It can impose arms embargoes, travel bans, or the severance of diplomatic relations also, and even the imposition of blockade as well. Now we'll be discussing that we need reforms in the United Nations Security Council. Now, what is the criteria for introducing reform? How we can change the membership of the United Nations Security Council? For a reform, for a change in the composition of the United Nations Security Council, there must be the agreement of the two-thirds of the United Nations member states, they have to vote in favor of the proposed reform in the United Nations General Assembly, and two-thirds of the member states must also ratify that proposal for reform. Additionally, every single member of the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council must agree for the reform that is proposed in the United Nations Security Council. Only then that reform can be taken up. Now, what is the need for reforms in the United Nations Security Council? One of the primary causes of concern is the veto power. The exercise of veto power by the P5 nations in the UNSC has been done either for their self-interest or for the protection of their allies. It has not been done for upholding democratic principles or the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. For example, the veto of the resolution upon the ceasefire, the proposed permanent ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, the veto was done by USA. We know about the number of casualties that have happened in Gaza and the blockade imposed by Israel. It is stopping the international aid from reaching Gaza, but still USA went ahead and vetoed that resolution. It was the only country which voted against that resolution, whereas 14 other members of the United Nations Security Council voted in favor of it. Similarly, the resolution related to Ukraine, the resolution to prevent and end the Russian military offensive in Ukraine, it was vetoed by Russia. It was the only country which voted against that resolution. 3 other countries although also abstained, obviously including India, China and UAE. Therefore, the exercise of the veto powers has not been for upholding the democratic principles. And if you observe the history of the exercise of veto powers, the maximum number of veto powers have been exercised by Russia and US only. Another need for reform is to ensure that the UNSC becomes more responsible and responsive, because the UNSC has not been responsive to the threats to the international peace and security. For example, the incidents in Rwanda. In Rwanda in 1994, there was a genocide, but the P5 nations were silently watching because they believed that it might turn out into a costly war. Therefore, they did not intervene. If there was a member state from the African continent among the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council, they would have fought for the intervention of the UNSC, because about 8 lakh people died in the Rwandan genocide, the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes in Rwanda. Similarly, the incident in Kosovo. In Kosovo in 1998, there was systematic murders, mass killings, mass atrocities upon the Kosovan Albanians, which was done by the Serbian and Yugoslavian forces. Again, the P5 nations, they were silently watching. Similarly, the Darfur crisis in 2004, which led to the years-long civil war, again which led to a huge number of casualties, but the P5 did not intervene again. Another need for reform is it justified to give a nation a permanent seat forever, a seat for life? Because power in international politics is not a constant. It keeps changing. For example, Great Britain and France, they were major powers at the time of World War II. But the decolonization post World War II led to the decline in their empires. Massive empires of Britain and France were decolonized, and that led to the shrinking of their power, of their influence. Therefore, do they deserve a permanent seat there forever? Similarly, the reforms in the UNSC, they have been long overdue. The UN has expanded, the United Nations has expanded from 113 member states to 193 member states approximately. But the United Nations Security Council, it has undergone expansion only once. After 1963, 4 more non-permanent members were added. Currently, it comprises of 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. Therefore, the reforms, the expansion is long overdue now. Plus, the UNSC composition currently does not represent the current geopolitics. The UNSC still represents the power structure of the time of the World War II. But there have been a change in the realities. The geopolitics have changed since then. And also there needs to be the representation of various geographies and representation on the base of the economic power also. For example, the G4 nations, they argue that they should be included among the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. 2 members from Asia, India and Japan, 1 member from Europe, that is Germany, and 1 member from Latin America, that is Brazil. And additionally, there can be 2 members from the African continent also. And Africa is the place where about 75% of the work of the United Nations Security Council takes place, but not even a single member of the African continent is part of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Similarly, the UNSC needs to ensure that its legitimacy survives, its credibility survives. For example, the interventions from the UNSC, they have again been for the vested interests. For example, the interventions in Libya, in Syria, on the ground of invoking of responsibility of UNSC, they have been questioned in the past. Therefore, more representation will ensure that the credibility of the UNSC survives. And there has been a divide, the deepening of the divide between the global north and the global south. The P5 represents the global north broadly, and there are emerging issues also which are the further need for the UNSC reforms. For example, the transnational threats, the environmental degradation, the growing economic interdependence. These emerging issues point towards the need for the reforming in the United Nations Security Council. Now, coming to the question of veto power specifically, should the veto power even be there for the permanent members of the UNSC? There are arguments both in favor of the veto power being exercised and against the existence of veto power in the hands of the permanent members. First, the arguments against the exercise of veto power by the permanent members. The concept of veto violates sovereign equality, because it is going against the principle enshrined in the UN Charter that all member states are equal, and it leads to the functioning of the UNSC being undemocratic, because just the vote of one member, one permanent member, can override the decision taken by the other 14 members of the United Nations Security Council. And it may even lead to therefore the paralysis of the council, because the council will not be able to take action, will not be able to pass the resolution, will not be able to take up intervention in case of a conflict, in case it has been vetoed by even one permanent member of the UNSC. Additionally, it is often abused for the national interest, as we have observed the number of vetoes exercised by both USA and USSR, and it is even used for blocking action on mass atrocities also. For example, in Rwanda, currently in Gaza also, preventing the resolution on ceasefire. Also, the UNSC current structure is a little outdated, as it is not representing the contemporary geopolitical dynamics, rather it is still representing the power structure of the time of the World War II. Additionally, there is no accountability regarding the exercise of veto power. There are no stipulated rules, there are no restrictions upon the usage of veto power, and sometimes the P5 nations even go for a kind of a hidden veto, that they go for the threat of the usage of veto power even before the resolution has been tabled, even before it is going for the voting. Sometimes they go for the double veto also. For example, they first veto it, tabling it as the procedural issue rather than the substantive issue, and then they veto the substantive issue also. Therefore, France even came up with a proposal that the veto power should not be exercised in case there are war crimes, in case there are genocides or such mass atrocities, then the veto power should not be exercised by the P5 nations. Now, there are certain arguments in favor of the exercise of veto powers as well, the veto power exercised by the UNSC permanent members, because the cooperation between the great powers was needed for the success of the UNSC, because otherwise it may fail like the earlier League of Nations. And for the cooperation among the great powers, their interests had to be protected to ensure that they are participating in the United Nations Security Council and its decisions can actually be implemented. And it may even lead to the prevention of a major conflict, because even a stalemate is better, even a status quo is better than a dissident great power being provoked into a World War III. Therefore, it may be better. And there is even a historical rationale that the victors of World War II, they were subsequently made the members or the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, their interests had to be protected, as it reflected the geopolitical realities. They had the military might, they had the economic might at that time. Therefore, the engagement of the P5 in the United Nations Security Council was crucial. Hence, the veto power was needed at that time. Now, why India must be made a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? We have seen that India has been one of the most frequently elected members of the UNSC, the non-permanent members of the UNSC who are elected for a term of 2 years at a time. And India is going to become a major global power soon. India is not a land of snake charmers that the British used to call us. They ridiculed us by saying so. Rather, we are going to become a space power. We have invested in the defense indigenization also. And we are the world's largest democracy. India accounts for almost 1/6 of the humanity. And we have such a large demography at our disposal, such a large human resource at our disposal. We are a major economic power also. India is soon going to become the third largest economy in the world as well. Plus, we are a proven contributor for the causes of the United Nations. For example, we have contributed for the peacekeeping missions. India is one of the largest troop contributors for the United Nations peacekeeping missions, the blue helmets as they are called. We are also actively engaged in the global forums, the forums for climate change, sustainable development goals, the Panchamrit goals for example, and also the voice for the reforms in the international institutions like WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc. We are also a voice for the global south. We can function as the platform, as the bridge between the global north and the global south, the geopolitical bridge and the voice for the interests of the global south. We are also the promoters of peace. That shows our credibility. For example, we have ensured that we adhere to the principles of non-alignment, the principles of Panchsheel for ensuring non-interference in the affairs of the other countries, or Article 51 in the Indian Constitution for fostering the respect for international law, for encouraging the settlement of disputes through settlements, through peaceful negotiations, mediation, etc. And we have international support also for our bid for getting the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. For example, the G4 grouping, they support our bid. Similarly, there has been support from the P5 nations also except China. And we have been a founding member of the United Nations also, and the modern reality that also reflects that India must be made a member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, there have been certain proposals for the enlargement, for the expansion, for the reform of the United Nations Security Council. For example, one of the earlier proposals was the Razali Plan. It was given by the Ismail Razali, who was the president of United Nations General Assembly at that time in 1997. He came up with a plan that there should be an expansion of the UNSC with 5 more permanent members, but these 5 more permanent members, they should not have any veto power, and 4 more non-permanent members in addition to the 15 existing members. So it will take the total membership of the UNSC to 24 members. So it will ensure a broader representation in the UNSC. Another plan was given by the High Level Panel. The High Level Panel, it was formed by the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. This panel came up with 2 models. The first model proposed that there should be expansion of the permanent members. There should be 6 more permanent members, 2 each for Asia and Africa and 1 each for Europe and Americas. And this expanded framework should not have any veto again, and there should be 3 more non-permanent members also, again taking the total composition to 24 members in total. They proposed another model as well, whereby they proposed that there can be introduction of semi-permanent members also. There can be 8 more semi-permanent members, and these semi-permanent members can be elected for a term of 4 years, which can be renewable as well, again without veto power, and there can be 11 non-permanent members. Then there was a proposal from the side of the G4 grouping. The G4 grouping comprises of India, Japan, Germany and Brazil. They proposed that there should be 6 more permanent members, and these 6 more permanent members should have the veto power as well, and they will comprise of the G4 nations plus 2 nations from the African continent, and there can be 4 more non-permanent members. But there has been an opposition also. The opposition regarding the expansion of the permanent members. This opposition has come from Uniting for Consensus proposal. They have proposed that the permanent members should not be expanded, rather the non-permanent members should be 20 in number in total. This grouping contains Pakistan as well. Another consensus was from the Isolvini consensus, the African Union grouping, which proposed again that there should be 6 more permanent members and 5 more non-permanent members, but they wanted 2 seats to be allocated to the African Union, the African members should be part of the permanent members and they should have the veto power as well in the UNSC. The L69 group proposal also came up with a similar idea that there should be 6 more permanent members and 6 more non-permanent members, even with veto power also, although they advocated for the abolition of the veto power altogether. Then there was a regional model as well, the Italian regional model, which proposed that there should be 10 more non-national permanent members. That rather than giving it definitely to some nations, there can be 2 permanent seats which can be given to the 5 regions. For example, 2 to Asia, 2 to Africa, and then the regions can decide for themselves, elect among themselves which 2 will be the permanent members and they should have the veto as well. Now, what suggestions can we give for the reforms in the UNSC, for the expansion of the UNSC? One, we can recommend that there should be a moderate expansion in the oligarchic structure. The oligarchic structure also helps in a few things. For example, it helps in the arriving of decisions quickly. It helps in timely decisions. Otherwise, if the UNSC also becomes very big, it will become unwieldy, just like the United Nations General Assembly. Then arriving of decisions through consensus will be difficult. Therefore, there can be 10 more permanent members which can be entered into the United Nations Security Council, and these seats can be distributed to 5 regional blocks in the United Nations. Rather than specifying the names of the countries, they can be given to the blocks, like 2 each for Asia, Africa, etc. and let the regions then determine which country should be made the part of the United Nations Security Council as permanent members. Additionally, the eligibility criteria can also be proposed for the UNSC permanent members. For example, for the global north countries to become part of the permanent members of the UNSC, there can be criteria like the contribution to the financial budget of the UN, their military might, etc. to represent the contemporary geopolitical realities. For the global south, there can be criteria like their demography, their population, plus their troop contribution to the UN peacekeeping missions, etc. And the veto power use should also be restricted in scope. For example, the French proposal not to use the veto power for the mass atrocities or the war crimes, etc. And additionally, we can go for the text-based negotiations also. The intergovernmental negotiations, they have been stalled since more than 1.5 decades, since 2008. The text-based negotiation should be promoted, and simultaneously, as long as the reform does not come through, India should also work on the backup plans. For example, engaging its presence in the multilateral fora, the expansion of its interactions with G20, BRICS, etc. There is a means practice question also. The structure and functioning of UNSC reflect post-World War II realities rather than contemporary global dynamics. In this context, examine the need for UNSC reforms. Why should India be considered for permanent membership? Give feasible suggestions for making the UNSC more representative and effective. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the fiscal health of the states, as the CAG has published a report highlighting the decadal analysis of the fiscal health of the states. So we will discuss the fiscal cost of high debt to GDP ratio for the states, the challenges that the states face in reducing their debt burden, also the need for fiscal stimulus measures as well, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. As per the CAG report, the public debt of all the states in India, all 28 states combined in India, has risen to close to 60 lakh crore as of fiscal year 2023. As compared to the decade earlier in fiscal year 2014, the combined debt of all the states was less than 18 lakh crore. So it has more than tripled over a decade. And in terms of the percentage of the combined gross state domestic product, in fiscal year 2023, the total debt was 23% almost as a percentage of the combined gross state domestic product. Therefore, the state should also follow the golden rule of borrowing. As per the golden rule of borrowing, the government should not borrow for revenue expenditure. The government should borrow for capital expenditure, for investment, for the creation of capital assets. Because that will lead to the growth in economy, that will lead to higher multiplier effect in the economy. And the CAG has also highlighted the states which have performed poorly. Punjab is the state with the highest debt to gross state domestic product ratio, as the debt in Punjab as a percentage of the gross state domestic product is highest, followed by Nagaland, followed by West Bengal, Himachal Pradesh and Bihar. So what will be the fiscal cost of a high debt burden? One of the cost will be the interest payment, because the government, if it is borrowing money, it will have to repay it along with the interest. Higher the debt burden, higher will be the interest payments. For the Union of India, if we consider the situation of the central government, it was more than 5% of the GDP, the interest payments alone. That is more than the combined budget allocated for education and health both. Therefore, the debt burden had to be brought down. Similarly, if the debt burden is already high, then the capability of the public exchequer to take up the stimulus measures, to take up counter-cyclical fiscal policy measures will be affected, because already it will be burdened under a lot of debt. And simultaneously, the lending to the manufacturing sector will be squeezed for the banks, because the banks, they also have their own restrictions. For example, they have to lend to the priority sector lending. Additionally, they have the requirements for statutory liquidity ratio. They have to maintain a certain proportion of the liabilities of the deposits that they get in terms of the government securities that the government uses itself, because that way it gets the cash, it gets the money at a cheaper interest rate. And simultaneously, if the debt burden is high, then the sovereign rating will come down. The sovereign rating given by various agencies, for example S&P, Moody's, etc., their rating will come down. If the sovereign rating comes down, then the interest rates that are charged by the external commercial borrowings, that will go up. There can be external commercial borrowings also which can be borrowed from the other countries. Then the interest that will have to be paid to them will be higher because of the liquidity crisis, etc. And today's borrowing is also taxing of tomorrow, because this debt burden, the interest repayments will have to be done by the future generations. Therefore, there are fiscal costs for the high debt burden. Now, simultaneously, there has to be fiscal activism as well, because counter-cyclical policies have to be taken up by the government. Fiscal stimulus measures have to be given when the economy is going through a downturn, when the economic growth is slow. Then the government has to take up the fiscal stimulus measures. It has to go for the investments in the capital assets. It has to go for infrastructure creation to trigger the economic growth, to trigger the economic cycle, to ensure that there is growth. Now, why it is needed? Because the multipliers are usually large. When the economy, when the monetary policy is near the zero lower bound, then the multipliers are large. And the multipliers are large usually because the investments, if done in the capital asset creation, there the multiplier will be large. For example, if the government wants to invest 100 rupees, if it is giving it to the citizens in the form of the increase in the salaries, for example, increase in the salaries for government servants, 100 rupees is given, then its contribution to the GDP will be less than 100 rupees. Therefore, the multiplier will be less than 1. Whereas if the government invests that 100 rupees for the creation of a capital asset, for example, building of a road, 100 rupees is done, then its contribution to the GDP for the Indian economy will be 250 rupees. That way, the multiplier will be 2.5 times. Therefore, the multipliers will be larger when it is done for the capital asset creation, for the capital expenditure rather than a revenue expenditure. Plus, the fiscal activism can pay for itself, because when the government is investing for the creation of capital assets, for the creation of infrastructure, for example, it will lead to generation of more employment, it will lead to increase in production, more employment will lead to rise in the salaries, more incomes, therefore more consumption capability. Therefore, if the salaries are increasing, the tax revenue will also increase. Due to the rise in the tax revenues, therefore, the fiscal stimulus can pay for itself. That revenue, if it is higher than the amount that has been invested by the government for the capital expenditure, it can pay for itself. And the government has a welfare motive also. For example, under Article 38 itself is a duty for the state, a directive principle for the state to minimize inequality and establish welfare. For that welfare motive as well, during the downturn in the economy, the government has to take up fiscal stimulus measures. Additionally, the debt sustainability depends upon the political will. We have never defaulted. The government has never defaulted on its debt in India. Even during the time of 1991 crisis, we even pledged gold, but we did not default upon our liabilities, unlike some Latin American countries which have defaulted in the past. Now, when we look at the Indian scenario specifically, we have high growth rates. We have one of the highest growth rates in the world because we are a developing economy, but we have a high inflation also. But still the growth rate is higher than the inflation, therefore we will be able to sustain the debt burden also, and we are on a convergence path. That is, the growth rates in the developing economies like India, they are much higher than the advanced economies, the developed economies like USA, Japan, South Korea, etc. And we have a high interest rate growth differential also. Now, what does interest rate growth differential mean? It means that if the interest rate that has to be paid upon the money that is borrowed for the investment, for the capital expenditure, is less than the GDP growth rate in the country, then through that GDP growth rate itself, that debt burden will be sustainable. That is, if the interest rate is lower than the GDP growth rate, then it will be sustainable. But if it is the other way around, that is, the GDP growth rate is lower, whereas the interest rate at which the money is borrowed by the government, it is higher, then it will not be sustainable. But we have a primary deficit also. Now, what is primary deficit first? Primary deficit is calculated by subtracting the interest payments from the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between the total revenue and the total expenditure of the government. If the total revenue is less than the total expenditure, it will lead to deficit. And if out of that fiscal deficit, the interest payments is subtracted, then it will lead to the primary deficit. The interest payments are given on the loans that have already been taken by the government. So we have a primary deficit also. And we have had the experience of 1991 and 2013. In 1991, there was almost a full-blown crisis, but we learned from that. And because in 1991 there was a fixed exchange rate before that, but after that we learned, and therefore there was not a crisis, full-blown crisis in 2013. Additionally, in India, we have an inherent bias in the fiscal stance. During the times of growth surges, the government usually gives for money for more asset creation, more infrastructure investments, for example, the mid-2000s. And when there is a downturn in the economy, for example, the global financial crisis in 2008, after that we had to take up the financial stimulus measures as well. Therefore, there is a need for a fiscal rectitude, fiscal prudence to bring down the debt to GDP burden to sustainable levels. Although there are green shoots also, for example, the GST, the implementation of GST has been improving, the collections have been improving, the administrative compliance has been improving, and simultaneously there have been recommendations from the FRBM Act, both the statutory recommendation as well as the recommendation of NK Singh panel, that there should be a limit upon the borrowings, and therefore the path should be clear for the government for bringing down the debt to GDP ratio. And at the same time, NK Singh panel even recommended that there can be an escape clause as well, that during the times of emergency, for example, war, external aggression, climate emergency, etc., then that time the government can go for more borrowings as well. But there are certain challenges that the states face in India specifically. Therefore, the debt to GDP ratio for the states are high. For example, the states have to go for higher social service expenditure as compared to the central government. For example, the expenditure in education and health, that is several times, close to 8 times that of the central expenditure, as we can observe that the state government's developmental expenditure and the social expenditure is more than the central government expenditure. For example, the development expenditure undertaken by the states, like in the agriculture sector, that is more than what the central government does in the agriculture sector. Similarly, they have to go simultaneously for capital expenditure as well for the job creation in the states. They have to disburse the pensions, salaries, subsidies, and there has been an erosion, alleged erosion in the state taxation autonomy. For example, through the implementation of GST, after that all the other state taxes were subsumed under it. For example, the value added tax which was imposed by the states earlier. And there are issues with the GST as well. For example, the demands for the compensation, the revenue lost by the states which do not have the manufacturing bases, and the demands for compensation therefore. And simultaneously, there has been a decrease in the grants in aid also. The grants in aid which are given usually by the central government, and that has come down from close to 2 lakh crore in 2015 to less than about 1.7 lakh crore. And there is the COVID revenue expenditure as well, which has affected the balance sheets of the public exchequers of the state governments as well, because during the times of COVID, the state governments also had to take up fiscal stimulus measures. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for ensuring fiscal prudence? One, the government can go for disinvestment, because disinvestment will lead to the increase in efficiency for the public sector undertakings. It may also lead to the revival of the sick PSUs as well. And the government should not give freebies, rather focus on the capital expenditure, because the revenue expenditure there, the multiplier effect is less than 1, whereas for the capital expenditure the multiplier effect is almost 2.5 times. And the subsidies in kind can also be reduced, because the subsidies in kind lead to ghost beneficiaries, leakages as well, whereas the direct benefit transfer will solve these issues. Also, the states should avoid reverting back to the old pension scheme, because in the old pension scheme the burden on the public exchequer for the states will increase. Additionally, the FRBM rule should be adhered to, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. If you look at the initiatives of the central government, as per the Union Budget 2025 data, the fiscal deficit for the central government has been brought down continuously. Also, the Niti Aayog has come up with a report on the Fiscal Health Index, in which it has highlighted that the strong revenue mobilization, effective expenditure management and prudent fiscal practices are required. There is a means practice question also. The growing public debt of the states poses a significant challenge to macroeconomic stability and sustainable development. Analyze the implications of poor fiscal health of the states. Suggest measures to ensure prudent fiscal management without compromising developmental priorities. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the tea industry and the ecosystem of the tea industry. This is important in GS3 under the topic major crops and cropping patterns, and also under Indian economy. First, let's have a look at some facts regarding the tea industry in India. India is the second largest producer of tea in the world. China is the largest producer of tea. 97% of the tea production in India happens in Assam, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And India accounts for 10% of the global exports of tea. India is among the top 5 global exporters of tea, and 19% of the global consumption of tea happens in India itself. But when we look at the exports of tea from India, it has been stagnant over the past half a decade or so. It needs to be promoted. Now, what are the conditions for growth for the crop of tea? It needs a temperature between 16 to 32 degrees Celsius for its growth. The rainfall should be between 15 to 300 centimeters. The tea is usually grown on the hill slopes, and the relative humidity requirement is high. It needs a relative humidity of mostly 80% for its growth, and minimum 40% relative humidity should be there. The area should not be frost prone also, and it requires acidic soil for its growth. The soil pH should be around 5, and it should have a good drainage facility as well. Now, there are certain challenges that the tea industry is facing. One of the challenge is due to the climate itself. The climate impact, it has an adverse impact on the production of tea. For example, the excessive rainfall sometimes. The excessive rainfall can lead to waterlogging, soil erosion, and the tea is usually grown on the hill slopes itself. And the drought also causes adverse impact on the crop production, because in the time of drought, there is dust in the air. That dust settles on the tea leaves, which blocks the sunlight and therefore blocks the growth of the tea leaves. And the frost can also damage the tea leaves, because the frost leads to the leaves becoming heavy and they break under weight. The melting of glaciers also causes damage to the tea crop, because the rock avalanches, the melting of glaciers, and therefore the landslides, it causes the damage to the hill slopes on which the tea is grown. Additionally, the weather driven drop in production is observed. For example, last year there were floods in Assam that damaged the crop of tea. Now, therefore, due to the drop in production, there has been the rise in the prices of the tea. Simultaneously, there has been a ban on some pesticides also. The alternatives to these pesticides are costly alternatives, but it led to a positive impact as well. Because of these ban on such chemical pesticides, the demand for the Indian tea grew in the regions of Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, etc. But the export broadly have declined. Why? Because the prices have gone high, but in the international market the prices are lower. The internal consumption at the same time has remained stagnant. The growers of tea, they are mostly small scale. About 55% of the tea production happens in those plantations where the area is less than 1 hectare. And there are pending subsidies from the tea board also, they are not released on time, and at times there is loss of premium quality as well, because during the first or second monsoon shower, that time the quality of tea is considered to be the best, but that is damaged during the monsoon showers itself. Now, the Tea Board of India is constituted under the Section 4 of the Tea Act 1953. It is a statutory body. It functions under the Ministry of Commerce. Now, what does it do? It regulates the tea producers, tea manufacturers, exporters, tea brokers, auction organizers, and even warehouse keepers as well. Now, how does it function? It conducts the market surveys, it tracks the consumer behavior, and it gives this relevant information to both the importers as well as exporters of tea. The head office of Tea Board of India is located in Kolkata. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for the promotion of the tea industry in India? One, we can go for the benchmarking of the prices along with the grading. The prices that should be based upon the cost plus model, that is, there should be a definite addition upon the prices in addition to the cost of production. The e-commerce should be integrated so that the tea can be supplied directly to the consumers, therefore the profit margins can be increased. The focus can be on the premium teas because the demand in the international market for that increases continuously. The palm oil can also be planted. The palm trees can be planted as a complementary crop, as it is suitable for the northeast region, plus it demands less water, it demands less labor also, it is less labor intensive. Also, we can go for the extension services. For example, training of farmers, as is done in Kenya. The Kenya Tea Promotion Agency goes for the farmer field schools. There the farmers, they are given training in the fine plucking, in the growing, as well as in the preparation for certification. The export destinations also need to be diversified to ensure that we are able to capture the market share in the international market. The full auction should be done for the boat tea leaf. As of now, just about 40% of the boat tea leaf is going for auction. Therefore, it affects the price realization. Full auction should happen. And we can also invest in the research and development. For example, the development of climate resilient varieties. Now, coming to the article, the climate change is affecting the crop patterns. The yields have been decreasing and the production is affected. There is also an increase in the pests and diseases also. Therefore, we need to arrest the drop in the yields. India also has another challenge, that we need new markets. Therefore, there is a proposal from the side of the industry that there can be a government campaign on the lines of Operation Flood or Operation Silver, which can also help in the growth of the tea industry. The generic promotion of the tea can be done to increase its consumption also, and we can explore new markets as well. For example, Africa, Ghana, and the old markets also, for example, Russia and Iran, where the exports have reduced. The next article is related to the geopolitics of Taiwan, as US President Trump has declined to approve a military aid package for Taiwan. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. First, let's have a brief look at the history of Taiwan. Taiwan before 1895 was under the Qing dynasty, and 1895 it was ceded to Japan. In 1945 it was again returned to China. After that, China was going through a civil war. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended, and the nationalists in China, led by Kuomintang, they fled to Taiwan. In Taiwan, they set up a government and they started laying claim to the entire mainland China. Therefore, China has always regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, which China says must be reunited with the mainland China, even if needed by force, by military force. Therefore, it follows the One China policy. Meanwhile, Taiwan has set up a democratic system for itself. It has adopted a constitution. It has even set up its own armed forces also. It even seeks international recognition as a separate country, as a sovereign country as well. But China has certain concerns with respect to Taiwan. as it was alleged that the earlier president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, might have gone for a formal declaration of independence, which did not happen because China does not allow it to happen, because Taiwan is extremely important for China. Taiwan is a semiconductor hub. It is the global leader in the production of semiconductor chips. It has a role in the first island chain. At the same time, China was concerned that there are growing ties between Taiwan and the United States. So what has been the role of USA in Taiwan? Initially, the USA supported the nationalist government of Taiwan in 1949, but later on it switched the diplomatic recognition in late 1970s. In 1979, it recognized the People's Republic of China, rather the mainland China, instead of Taiwan. But at the same time, it enacted the Taiwan Relations Act, through which it could sell the arms to Taiwan. Therefore, it has adopted a policy of strategic ambiguity, the USA policy of strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan. So it gives military and diplomatic support. It conducts frequent naval and the air patrols also, and it considers Taiwan as a democratic partner and even a counterweight to the Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Indian interests are also involved in Taiwan. For example, we are dependent upon our ties with Taiwan for the trade in the region, because South China Sea dependence is there for the trade in the Indo-Pacific, and the security concerns are also common because China goes for its assertiveness. The land grabbing nature of China is well known. And also we have similar principles, democratic principles like the common values of freedom, human rights and the rule of law, which are upheld and respected. We need cooperation from Taiwan for the advancement in technology, cutting edge technology, digital transformation, startup ecosystem, and we have cultural ties also, for example, tourism, education, people to people ties, etc. So what has been India's policy stand with respect to Taiwan? We have had diplomatic relations since 1995. And we have cooperation in business, tourism and consular services are also provided. And we promote the peaceful resolution, therefore, of the cross-strait issues through dialogue. Now coming to the article, the US President Donald Trump has declined to approve $400 million in military aid to Taiwan in the recent months, because there have been negotiations going on between US and China for a trade deal and a potential summit in Beijing also. This has been a departure of the USA from its earlier policy with respect to the democratic island, because Taiwan has always faced a constant threat of invasion by China. The next article is related to the voter deletion. This is important in GS2 under the topic Salient Features of the Representation of Peoples Act. This debate has been in the news, so let's first discuss what are the legal provisions for the deletions from the electoral rolls. It can be done as per the provision of Section 22 of the Representation of Peoples Act 1960. Therefore, the electoral registration officers, they can make corrections. They can also delete the names in the electoral rolls as well. It can be done either on their own motion, that is suo motu, or on the applications received. But before deletion, they have to conduct an inquiry. The inquiry is mandatory and they have to give the elector whose name they are going to edit or delete, they have to give them the time to respond also, they have to give them the notice. Now, the grounds on which the name can be deleted from the electoral rolls are if the person has died, or the person is no longer ordinarily resident, or the person is ineligible to be a voter. That is, he is not a citizen of India anymore, or he is under 18 years of age. Now, how can the electors apply for the deletion of a name in the roll? The Form 7 they have to fill for the objection for the proposed inclusion or the deletion of a name. To delete one's own name or to object to another name in the same constituency, that person also has to be an elector in the same constituency. So it can be done online. The Form 7 can be filled online, whereby an account must be created on the voter portal or the app, and the phone number must be linked to the EPIC number, the elector's photo identity card number. Now this Form 7 can be filled. This application can be given for the deletion of a name from the electoral roll in a constituency only by an elector who is himself registered in that constituency. This will require the applicant's details also, and the person whose name is to be deleted, his details also, the details like name, EPIC number, etc. Plus the region must also be selected. But the concern is no evidence is required to be uploaded while the Form 7 is filled. the person who is asking for the deletion of the name of another person from the electoral roll does not have to give any evidence in support of his claim. Just a signed declaration is uploaded that if he is giving false statements, then they are punishable. Now, how is it processed? These forms, they are not processed centrally. They are processed rather locally by the electoral registration officers at the level of the local ERO. But that ERO must issue a notice. The elector will then get 7 days to respond to the notice. Then a hearing will be conducted, and after that only an order will be passed by the electoral registration officer. Simultaneously, the booth level officers are also employed. They conduct field visits for the verification of the claims. Now, are there gaps in this online system? Yes, there are a few lacunas. For example, there is no proof which is required. No proof is required to be uploaded along with the Form 7 online. Also, there are identity verification gaps. For example, what is the proof that the EPIC number and the linked phone number actually belongs to the person? There is a potential for misuse therefore. For example, there can be linking of someone else's EPIC number with another person's phone number, and this has been the allegation in Karnataka. Even the Election Commission of India has admitted that this gap exists, but there are safeguards also. The safeguard is that there is a mandatory inquiry which needs to be conducted, an inquiry by the electoral registration officer and the visit by the PLO. The next article is related to the Chabahar port. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. The Chabahar port is a deep water port situated in Iran's Sistan Baluchistan province, and it is in the Gulf of Oman near the Strait of Hormuz. It is the only Iranian port with direct access to the Indian Ocean, and it comprises of two port terminals. One is Shahid Beheshti terminal, which India is developing, and another is Shahid Kalantri terminal. It is on the transit center on the International North-South Transport Corridor. The INSTC is a multimodal transportation route. It connects the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea via Iran and further on to the Northern Europe via St. Petersburg in Russia. Therefore, if the cargo movement happens through this route, it will lead to the saving of cost in 30% and the time also, as 40% time will be saved. It also will affect the strategic influence that India has, which will increase, and it will improve the regional stability as well. The Kandla port in Gujarat is just about 550 nautical miles from the Chabahar port. The Chabahar project was signed in 2016. It was a tripartite agreement with India, Iran and Afghanistan to develop the Shahid Beheshti terminal. It is India's first foreign port project, and it also includes the construction of a rail line from Chabahar port to Zahedan, and it will ensure the bypassing of Pakistan to access Afghanistan and then to Central Asia as well. Therefore, it functions as the alternative route to the traditional Silk Road. But there are a few challenges in the development of the Chabahar port. For example, there is a risk of the USA imposing sanctions upon India. Earlier, we had got a waiver from the sanctions of USA for the development of the Chabahar port, but now the US President has revoked the sanctions waiver that India had gotten. And now the US President Donald Trump is going for a maximum pressure campaign for isolating the regime of Iran. Another challenge is the disruptions caused in the Red Sea by the Houthi rebels. It may affect the traffic which goes to the Chabahar port as well. There are security concerns in Afghanistan also. India wanted to get a connect to Afghanistan through the Chabahar port, but USA has exited from Afghanistan. Additionally, there are regional tensions also. For example, the Iran-Israel regional tensions. And there is competition for the Chabahar port. Competition from similar projects like the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Competition from China, which is also developing similar port terminals. The next article is related to the Mysuru Dasara, which is set to be opened by the Booker Prize winner Banu Mushtaq. This is important in prelims for art and culture. First, let's discuss regarding the Booker Prize. It is the world's leading literary award which is given for a single work of fiction. It was founded in the UK in 1969. Initially, it was awarded to the authors from the Commonwealth only, but now it can be awarded to anyone regardless of the origin of the author. And it is given usually for the best novel of the year which is written in English. The eligibility criteria for the Booker Prize is that any novel which is originally written in English and it is published in the UK and Ireland in the year of prize can get the Booker Prize. It can be regardless of the nationality of the author, but the original work has to be in English only. It should not be a translation, and it should be published by a registered UK or Irish imprint. It should not be self-published also. The Booker Prize gives 50,000 euro as the prize. Additionally, 2,500 euro is also given for the shortlisted authors as well. It is given by the Booker Prize Foundation, which is a registered charity there established in 2002. Now coming to Mysuru Dasara, it is a 10-day festival that commences with Navratri and concludes during Vijayadashmi, which is on the 10th day of the Hindu calendar month of Ashvina, and it is to celebrate the victory of goddess Chamundeshwari against Mahishasur, the buffalo-headed demon, and therefore the name of the city Mysore came into being. It originated in the 15th century during the rule of the Vijayanagar Empire. It finds a mention as well in Matlau Sadden wa Majmaul Bahrain by a Persian ambassador Abdul Razzaq. The key highlight is the Jambu Savari, that is a traditional Dasara procession held on the streets of Mysuru, whereby the idol of goddess Chamundeshwari is placed on an elephant, and the Mysuru place in this time is lit up throughout the 10 days with 1 lakh light bulbs, and the Mysuru exhibition was also started by the Maharaja of Mysuru in 1880. Thank you.